This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken begin today's show with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. This week they discuss chronic wasting disease and the concerns that come with it, and how people can be watchful. Next in the show is K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth to provide answers to questions he has been receiving about termites and wheat aphids. With the low supply of replacement dairy heifers driving up costs, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends today's show discussing how to avoid making unnecessary culls and identify animals that should be sold. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers from K-State's Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. And Drew, you're going to lead today, and there's a note that came out, I think, that you want to chat about related somewhat to CWD.
I wanted to get ahead of this sort of news that's come out because of the note in neurobiology that is reported a couple of people that got Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is the prion disease in people that would be what they would call it if there was human transmission of CWD. And I know Field and Stream has published an article about that, really quickly. And so I just figured we ought to talk about it.
Keep saying CWD. What are we talking about today?
Yeah, so chronic wasting disease is a disease that infects cervids, and cervids are members of the deer family. And it's what we call a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. So TSE is what we would usually say, but that describes a group of diseases that can be transmitted, so transmissible. They cause a spongiform transformation of the brain tissue. So basically, it creates a bunch of holes and sponginess in the brain tissue, and encephalopathy is swelling of the brain. So that TSE is basically describing the symptoms and the things that happen. But these are caused by infectious prions, and prions are a really weird thing to think about from an infectious organism point of view. So all mammals have prions in our body. We have them in our brains, and they're an important part of our physiology, I guess. And they're basically a kind of protein. And when those proteins get mutated, they can do a couple of different things. They can attack our own bodies, and sometimes they become infectious from individual to individual within the same species or from species to species. So, there's a bunch of these, and there's a fair bit of concern about the ones that people could be potentially exposed to because there's been documented human transmission of mad cow disease to people.
You've mentioned kind of a little bit of an introduction here. Kind of give us maybe a synopsis about what the findings in this paper, or more maybe a note is more accurate there.
So this note in neurobiology basically describes two cases of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD, in two older men who were apparently acquaintances. They knew each other. In the title of the paper, it says they were from the same hunting lodge, and they are from an area where chronic wasting disease has been detected in the deer population. And it's really the first time that there's been any link between people who are known to have consumed deer from a population where there could be chronic wasting disease. So that's basically it. The second person who died had the genetic predisposition that all of the documented cases of mad cow transmission to people also had. And so that person has a known genetic makeup that could make them susceptible to getting something like that from a different species. And so, from the scientific community standpoint, this paper is basically just letting other scientists know, hey, this happened, and it's important that we do surveillance to see if there's more cases and that sort of thing.
It's a big enough deal that we kind of want to be made aware of it, but making any sort of connections is probably a hard thing to do, right? And It's also 2 individuals, and so relatively small sample size. It's important information to get out there. It's also important that we really understand what it's saying and don't necessarily jump to conclusions. So these deer that get CWD, I mean, what's that look like? Do they go eat one day and start getting sick the next, or does it have a period where you don't know if they have it? What's that look like?
Yeah, so the incubation period, or the time from when they're exposed until the time that they start to have symptoms, can be anywhere from 1.5 to 4 years.
Wow.
So you don't typically see it in fawns. But, if you've got 1.5-year-old deer that were produced by a female who was CWD positive, they could start having symptoms at that point. Another interesting thing is they can shed the infectious prions after about 6 months. So there could be anywhere from a year to 3.5 years of time where they've got this stuff, they can spread it, but they don't look like a sick animal. So, the idea that I didn't harvest a sick-looking animal so I don't have to worry about it, well, that's not really a good idea. If you're in an area with CWD and you're concerned about it, you ought to have them tested even if they look healthy.
You say a sick animal. What would a deer, obviously you just said they might not show symptoms, but if they are showing symptoms, what would a deer look like that has CWD?
Yeah, so basically what this is a neurodegenerative disease. We talked about it affecting the brain and the nervous system. You get these amyloid plaque buildups along with that spongiform transformation. And so the way I describe it is, think about someone who has Alzheimer's, where the brain has started to degenerate enough that it's affecting the animal's ability to eat, to understand what's going on around it, and all those sorts of things. So, a CWD-infected animal tends to be very skinny. They tend to be very lethargic. Their head tends to droop because they're weak. They're wasting away, basically. Drooping ears is another symptom that's pretty common. One of the things that is interesting about this is they become aggressive. And a lot of the transmission, we talked about was individuals interacting with one another. And so fighting is a way that researchers think that this is spread commonly. Well, if this is making especially male deer more aggressive and they're fighting a lot more and transmitting it among one another, then that could explain one of the reasons why we see the prevalence typically a lot higher in male deer than we do female deer, which is something that we do see.
How would you know if your deer that you're processing, if they don't always show symptoms, how would you know if that deer has CWD?
That's a big challenge with all of this because we don't have a rapid field test yet. So the recommendation is that if you're hunting deer, if you harvest a deer in an area with known CWD prevalence, then you ought to get it tested. And the way to get that tested is typically going to be some sort of process that's facilitated by your state wildlife agency. You can also submit samples directly to some places that process samples. So in Kansas, your 2 options would be to submit a sample through Wildlife and Parks. If they're sampling in your area, they tend to sample region by region, and so if they're sampling your region that year, you might be able to get a free test through them. The other way to get a sample tested in Kansas would be to submit a sample to the K-State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, and there'll be a small fee associated with that. I think it's $25 or somewhere. It's less than $50, but they would process that sample for you. The big challenge is, well, what do I do with my deer between the time when I harvest it and when I get the results back? So, my recommendation would be that we debone the deer in the field, put that meat in, probably double bag it, and be really careful about, getting fluids and those sorts of things on the outside of a large trash bag and then isolating that meat. If you had a small freezer that you could just put your deer meat in, that'd be even better. Once you get that test result back, if it's positive, then that meat should either be buried deep in a landfill or take it back to where you harvested the deer and bury it there. If it's not positive, then you carry on with, processing that meat.
Sure, and that's where the concerns potentially from this note came from, is that there could be, although there are no positive links, but the concern is that eating that infected venison then could ultimately transmit to humans. Is that correct?
That is. And that's been the recommendation for as long as I've been talking about this stuff, 10 years at least, is that, if you harvest a deer in an area where there's known CWD prevalence, you ought to get it tested, and you hadn't ought to eat it if it comes back positive.
What's the take-home message of that? Should we be sounding the alarms and panicking? Should we not care at all, somewhere in between? What should we be thinking, in your opinion, Drew?
Well, I think that my take-home message from it is that note provides the first potential link for human transmission, and that it's something to be aware of. But it's still probably even a long way from a smoking gun. But it's just some more evidence that goes into the pot, and something to be aware of, and something we should think about. But it's sure, for me, it's not an alarm, but it's also not something to totally ignore. I think I mentioned that it's weird that two friends would have Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. I mean, that's a strange coincidence when we only have about one case per million people per year. There's 350 cases of this stuff annually in the U.S. But, it's something to be aware of. It's not something that is going to make me quit eating deer. It's something that will probably make me be more concerned about getting deer tested and those sorts of things. And it's kind of a wait-and-see sort of deal for me. But it's not evidence that says CWD is definitely transmitted to people from eating deer, but it's also not something that everybody should just totally ignore probably either.
That was Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken. You can listen to the full episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers by going to the link in today's show notes or by finding it on the podcast streaming platform of your choice. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about pests with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, sure. My pleasure. Anytime.
Jeff, as we talk about different pests, first, talking about termites, something you've been receiving a few questions about.
Yes, termites, across the United States, we, in the past 100 years, spend billions every year trying to mitigate, control pests or damage caused by termites. Termites are a real problem. They're still a problem. Anything we make out of wood, that's their natural food source, we become an enemy of a termite. So the last 4 or 5 years, I've not received a lot of calls about termites. I think primarily because we've had relatively dry springs. And in the spring is generally when the termites swarm. That's usually when I get calls. This year, it's still pretty dry around the state, but for some reason, I have received several calls about termite swarms, so I thought maybe it'd be a good time just to run through the difference between ants and termites very quickly, because hopefully it will rain in the next few days. As it rains, that ups the humidity. Then we have more termite and ant swarms that people get concerned about, I guess. The difference between an ant and a termite, really very easily to distinguish. The swarmers I'm talking about, the swarmers, the ones that are actually flying, they have dark bodies on ants, shiny black, dark brown, whatever you want to call it. Termites have 2 pair of wings, and they're equally long. They look very similar, both pairs. Ants have 2 pair of wings, but the forewings or the front pair of wings are a lot larger than the hind wings. Termites have a body that's more what we call cigar-shaped. Ants have a waist. Very distinguishable waist between their thorax and their abdomen. So it's a very tiny, constricted area. And the last really distinguishable area is the antennae. Ants have what we call elbowed antennae, which means they come out from the head and then they make a 90-degree turn and go forward, whereas termites have antennae that just go straight out from the head. So if you look at the swarmers, they're really easy to tell the difference from. The thing is, in both cases, ants or termites, the swarmers, they come out when the weather conditions are right, and usually that's 9, 10, 11 o'clock in the morning before it gets too hot. After a rain, they swarm literally by the hundreds or the thousands or the tens of thousands. And those swarmers, they mate, and the females will go off and look for a crack or a crevice or someplace, go down in and start laying eggs. And that's where the new colonies of termites and or ants come from. And then that swarming is usually over by 1, 2 o'clock. The next day you may get a smaller swarm. Next day maybe another secondary or smaller swarm. But it's generally that one day when those weather conditions are just right. You can see a lot of ants swarming or a lot of termites swarming. That's where those colonies get started from. Probably less than 1% actually survive. It's not a very high survival rate. That's why there's so many of them. But that's where we get termites. So if you see a colony of termites, ants are they're the enemy of termites. So if you have ants, you won't have termites around in the area. But if you see a colony of termites, if they're swarming from your barn or your house or an outbuilding or someplace, that's an indication that you have an existing colony, because it takes 2 or 3 years for the termite colony to build up enough to produce swarmers. So those swarmers, the ones you see now going off to lay eggs, they'll start in the ground, find some old decaying wood to feed on, and it'll be 3 or 4 years later before they produce swarm. And that wood generally is decaying trees or roots or stumps or something in the ground, but it can also be your house or your barn or whatever. Anything made out of cellulose, anything made out of wood, they can utilize as a food source. So just be aware, make sure you can tell the difference between an ant and a termite. Ants are just, they're not going to destroy the wood unless it's carpenter ants. Carpenter ants can be a problem, but they really don't destroy the wood. They don't feed on the wood. They just nest in the wood. That's how you tell the difference between termite swarmers and ant swarmers. So it's very important that you know the difference when you see a swarm around your house. And like I said, they're just now doing that. April, again, it's all related to the weather, but April traditionally has been a time for ants and termites to swarm in Kansas. It looks like maybe, hopefully, we're going to get some rain this week, and so the termites should be swarming later in the week as it warms up a little bit.
And wanting to give a quick update on where alfalfa weevils are. Yes,
we're still having problems with alfalfa weevils. I do not like alfalfa weevils. First, let me preface that, because every year when they occur early in the year before that first cutting, they're a problem for several reasons. Number one, they're voracious. Number two, because of the weather. We've had 40, 50-mile-an-hour days of wind. We've had rain, sleet, snow, all that kind of stuff. That keeps growers and producers and applicators out of the field, but it doesn't keep the weevils from eating. They eat 24/7 anytime the temperature's over 45 degrees. So right now, around at least the north-central part of the state, the weevils are starting to pupate. What that means is the feeding is winding down. You're not going to see as much damage, hopefully, in the next week as you did the preceding week, because as the larvae become adults, they feed a little less, and then they just pupate. They'll become an adult. The adults really don't feed much. They might feed a little bit, which will be a little bit of a concern to folks, but we generally don't recommend treating adults. They will leave the fields anytime, as soon as the field's swathed the first time, or the temperatures get up to 85, 90 degrees for a couple of days, the adults will leave. So they're not going to be a problem. So just bear in mind, the treatment threshold is still about the same as prior, but make sure you get out and there's no pupae in the field, and the pupae will be inside little white cocoons that look like, white silk thread. Sometimes they're pretty well camouflaged, but generally they're pretty noticeable. So once that happens, the population is pretty much on the downhill trend towards feeding, so you shouldn't have much more damage in your alfalfa in the next week or two at least. So, and they won't be back this year. It'll be next spring before they come back. So hopefully that's a little good news, because the last month or so the weevils have really been feeding voraciously around the state.
Jeff, wanting to talk about wheat aphids and their migration in.
Yes, the wheat aphids, primarily green bugs and the bird cherry oat aphid, those are the two main aphids we have problems with in wheat in Kansas. But there's like 24 or 25 others. They have been migrating into the southern part of the state for the last 7 to 10 days. We've started picking them up on the Oklahoma border. They're starting to migrate a little further north throughout the state. So just a heads up, you might see some aphids in your wheat. The reason I bring that up, because I've already gotten several questions from South Central and Southwestern wheat producers that are getting ready to spray their wheat for a fungus. They're going to use a fungicide, and they want to know if they should put an insecticide in with their spray to kill the aphids that are there. Generally, we don't recommend that unless you have a treatment threshold on the aphids. This time of year, they will affect the wheat if they get in like 50 or more per tiller, between the boot and the heading stage of the wheat. Sometimes they can affect it, especially under dry conditions, and we do have dry conditions. If we get good growing conditions, generally the wheat can outgrow even those kind of populations, but keep that in mind. That's kind of the treatment threshold for aphids, and that's throughout the whole field, because if you're sampling the southern part of your field, that's where the aphids are building up first because they're migrating in on the southern winds. We really don't recommend putting an insecticide in with a fungicide. I understand you're saving the application cost, so it's considerably cheaper. And if you do, make sure it's an insecticide that's compatible as a tank mix with whatever fungicide you're using. And if you do, make sure you look at the reentry period before you can go back into that field after you spray that insecticide, because you might want to get out and check, another week or two, and the reentry period may be 10 days or something. Each one's different, so just check the label with whatever insecticide you use. Make sure it's compatible with the fungicide. But remember, when you spray that insecticide, you're going to kill all the beneficials, the lady beetles, the green lacewings that are helping to control those aphids right now. And the question I always get, well, the aphids they vector barley yellow dwarf, right? One of the viruses that causes the disease is called barley yellow dwarf. Not all aphids carry the vector, but that virus is not as bad when it comes in the spring as it does in the fall. So just keep all that in mind. You're going to start seeing more aphids, I think, in wheat in the next week or two. Once it gets up to the heading stage, probably not going to be so bad. But between boot and heading, that's when everybody gets concerned about anything feeding on the wheat. And I understand that.
Jeff, rain something that help all of these issues a little bit?
Oh, rain, baby, rain. Yeah, we need that. If you get good growing conditions, it allows alfalfa, it allows wheat, it allows all the crops to withstand insect feeding a lot better. It's not going to help virus transmission, but it dang sure helps the plant withstand any damage or any stress that the insects may cause.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us an update on some pests that producers might be seeing.
Sure, my pleasure. Anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. The low supply of replacement dairy heifers is driving up costs. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk discusses some options for addressing the situation, which is expected to last for at least a few more years. He recommends reviewing culling practices to avoid making unnecessary culls and identifying animals that could be sold to take advantage of the higher prices.
Today, I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers, considering the outlook that we have for replacement heifers as we move forward in the next few years. Most of you are probably aware that we currently have the lowest supply of replacement dairy heifers in our industry that we've seen since about 2015. This has resulted in higher prices for these replacement animals. And recently, as we look at some of the auctions, it's not uncommon to find heifers selling for more than $2,500 each. So what can you do to take advantage of this and also to insulate your dairy farm from these higher prices? Number one, we need to take a look at culling practices on our dairy, making sure that we are culling the correct animals. We do still need to cull on our dairies, and we want to make sure that we make wise choices. So paying attention to what we're doing in our culling practices becomes important as we try to eliminate unnecessary culls from the dairy. So what would I consider as an unnecessary cull? Well, As we look at the reasons that we cull dairy cattle, on most of our farms, the number one reason will likely be reproduction, and the second will be actually mastitis. So as you look at your dairy, what can you do to improve the number of pregnant cows that you have on your dairy? As you improve your pregnancy rate on the dairy, you will actually reduce the need that you have for cull cows because you'll have fewer animals that you're culling due to lack of reproductive performance. As we think about mastitis, again, it's all about control. Some of this occurs in the milking parlor. Some of it occurs in the animal housing area. So you need to evaluate both. I would encourage you to do this with your herd veterinarian to identify those issues that we might be having on the farm with higher somatic cell cows and needing to cull animals because they actually have mastitis, or they just seem to have cell counts that are high, multiple test days during the year. So as we look at that, you're probably going to have to do some culturing of your milk samples to determine what type of organisms you're actually dealing with. As we take control of our mastitis situations on our dairy, we can reduce the number of culls that we make due to mastitis. Now, as you look at your replacement heifer supply, many of you may find that if you can reduce the amount of culling that you're currently doing, you can also have some heifers available for sale. Why do I think that's important? Well, our current situation with the shortness in our heifer supply is partially associated with the fact that more of our farms are using sex semen and breeding a certain percentage of their animals to beef semen so that they have a higher value calf. It's great for our industry and has produced extra income on the dairy farm, but has also reduced the number of heifers that we might have in our inventory. So if you can reduce your cull rate and your need for replacement heifers within your herd, gives you either the opportunity to sell excess heifers as springers or maybe as freshened 2-year-olds, or you can increase the amount of beef cross calves that you're producing on your dairy and reduce the heifer replacement herd size, which will also save you money as well. So as you look at your heifer replacements and what we're going to experience likely for the next several years in terms of a higher heifer value for springers as well as a shortness of supply, gives you an opportunity to explore some different avenues to increase the revenue on your farm, either through selling excess heifers and or reducing the number of culls that you might have in your dairy herd. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.